First of all, welcome. We have a couple of guests from Irondequoit, I understand, which makes me happy because I spent my first 12 years in Irondequoit. First 5 years at 129 Dake Avenue, and the next wonderful 6 or so years at 345 Birch Hills Drive, which is one of those 3 houses right down on the lake with the Hojack Lines Railroad right behind us, gullies of Durand Eastman Park surrounding us. I had this dream as a kid, this repeating dream, because our house was up here with this, and by the way, it was not some majestic house, but it was a wonderful place geographically. And we could look out our back windows and there was Lake Ontario, and then there were still railroad tracks there, and the train would come by once a week, like Petticoat Junction. And then there was this rusty old stairway that went down to the beach. And I had a recurring dream that we were swimming in the lake like we often did, or grabbing a big old floating log that we would pretend was our boat or our submarine. And a train would come by and it would roll off the tracks and come down the bank, and there were big boulders along the beach. And we would hide underneath the boulder, and the train would come over us and it would miss us, and it would go in the lake, and steam would go up in the lake. Every damn night. But what a great place to grow up. So glad you're here. I went to Durand Eastman School.
Oh.
Talk about a historic school.
My father-in-law taught there and then went on to Eastridge. Ed Flesh, his name was.
Well, I remember Miss McNett, who was my first grade teacher. And you know, when you're a little kid, your perspective can be a little bit off. I thought she was very, very old. And the reason that came to me decades later that I thought she was so old is because she was very, very tall. And now I know I have a granddaughter who equates height with age. She's a very short teacher. She's really young. So anyway, enough about all that. Welcome. It's great to see you all here together. Usually I bump into 1 or 2 of you when you're on duty, and it's nice to see the group together. It's so great that you hold this event. I guess we want to talk a little bit about history, and please interrupt me whenever you like. But in thinking about this, and usually I have stuff behind me which I lean on dramatically to keep me remembering what it is I want to talk about. So I'm going to do something completely different today and just pull stuff out of my brain. When we talk about Perinton and Fairport, and Egypt, and Bushnell's Basin, and Fulham Town, or Fulham's Basin as it was sometimes called, it becomes a fairly confusing community, I would think. But how did we get here? And you know, we can go all the way back to 1680s when French, some called them explorers, some called them marauders, decided to tangle with our Native Americans in the area. And it was really, some would say it was about spreading religious philosophy, and some would say it was about commerce, and that the French were a little bit upset that the English had a corner on the trade with the Indians, the Native Americans. So that came right through our town, though, right through the corner of our town, right around where Bushnell's Basin is. And you know, you can fast forward then to after the Revolutionary War, when the Phelps and Gorham land purchase came to be and opened up an office in Canandaigua, and there was this great migration westward from the eastern original colonies and the crowds of people in cities who wanted to go west. And there was available cheap, great land for farming. And we became this location among so many other places. That's how our earliest settlers got here. Oftentimes, those lands were divided and subdivided again before even someone was on the land. What you had was something like 65 plots of land about 220 acres or so each, that became the original subdivision of what became the town of Perinton. But if that's not confusing enough, before that we were part of a bigger town named Boyle. And before that we were part of an even bigger town called Northfield. Pittsburgh's always talking about Northfield. Northfield Commons. Northfield is part of their heritage, very much so. But it's part of ours too, because the town of Northfield, when it was first formed, I'm guessing circa 1800 or so, or a year or two earlier perhaps, went all the way to the Genesee River, eastbound, and included towns such as Brighton today, Pittsburgh, Henrietta, Perinton, Penfield. Went on to this place called Boyle I talked about to school kids. And I think, how would you like to live in a town named Boyle? That would be horrible. So we went on to Perinton, which is spelled so many different ways in our own town records. We were fortunate not too long ago to have the Rochester Genealogical Society send a group of volunteers to our town hall and volunteer their efforts with a special scanning machine that took index cards that we had of our earliest town records, 65,000 index cards they digitized for us.
Oh my gosh.
Let me tell you the weird story about how history. Now, you were one of them.
Yeah.
Those RGE guys, Rochester Genealogical Society guys. And I hear you're back in business again. You're rejuvenating that effort.
Bought new equipment and updated the technology.
And when you were here with the technology you had, it was such a godsend. Let me just tell you the story about those ridiculous index cards and what they mean. We are so lucky to have in this community these approximately 65,000 documents that span from the first town meeting in 1813 to about 1920 or so. The index cards were created perhaps in this room. Because what happened, if you go back to the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, part of the initiatives that were going forth was to train people, particularly young people, with some skills coming out of the Depression, people who needed employment, but they needed some skills, and put them to work while learning something. So they had them create an index card for every one of these 65,000 documents. Those index cards were put in special wooden file boxes about this wide and about this long, about 15, 20 of them. And then they were promptly lost. And then they were found. And then they were lost again. Eventually they turned up, and through your organization's help, they've been digitized. You can actually find the digitized copies of these 65,000 index cards on the Rochester Genealogical Society website.
RGS.com.
And you go to a special section that has collections and so forth. Look for Perinton and you'll find them. So they're very useful. And I send people to your website all the time in order so that they can do some research on their own. I digitized during COVID. COVID was so handy for so many things where you could work at home. I worked at home for easily a month scanning the first 35 years of the town's records. Now I have to tell you, the first year there was like 6 documents. You know, the second year there was like 12 documents. The third year there was 24 documents, and they have grown exponentially ever since. You know, now we create more documents in 10 minutes than we did in the first year. So it's a great capturing of our history in that way. Talked about the Phelps and Gorham Purchase. The 2 Perrin brothers came here, and they were 2 of the earliest. Even the people that weren't named Perrins married Perrins in some cases. Abner White, when you drive south out of the village up to 234 South Main Street, there's a historic marker up there. Aaron White married a Perrin girl. Some of our earliest folks. I've told you about these different communities that we've had. Let's talk about that for a minute. Because the village of Fairport, as a real named entity, didn't exist early on. Fairport was here because there was a port. There wasn't a port until there was a canal. But Perinton was established in 1812. But our earliest settlers got here in 1789, 1790. And if you know the intersection of Aralt Road and Turk Hill Road, that's kind of considered Perinton Center. There's a farm there. Right?
Stinky farm.
Kids on my bus, when I drove a school bus for fun for a while, and it was great because I'd make it a rolling history lesson every time. And there's a huge debate about, wait a minute, is it the stinky farm or the smelly farm? Either way, it's a pretty important asset of the community, and it's been there a long, long time. And the family before the Ellsworths, who have been there forever, turns out they weren't really there forever. The Slocum family was there first. So that corner was really where some of the earliest of settlers arrived to. And some evidence of that, this Slocum family, well, they owned that farm, and they owned much of that acreage. And here's a nice bit of history trivia for you folks that are going to be dealing with history so much, where all the farm tractors and trucks with trees growing through the roof, and I'm talking about the southwest corner of that intersection is kind of a notorious spot. There's plenty of evidence that there's a cemetery there. We have a lot of cemeteries in Fairport and Perinton. Like sometimes I'll talk to the East Rochester historian. They'll say, wow, we only have one cemetery. And I said, well, you don't even have that because that's in our town. Whitehaven. But we have 10, 11 cemeteries in our community, and that doesn't count the little family burial grounds that every once in a while pop up. But this hidden cemetery underneath all that farm stuff, 100 years ago was referred to as the slave cemetery. And there are writings about that going back that far back, and the information that we have leads us to believe that the Slocum family arrived here perhaps with slaves, although I have not documented that, but perhaps with former slaves, as was often the case. You know, in New York State, do you know when slavery was abolished in New York State?
1834.
In the origins of it in the late 1820s, but it rolled out incrementally, right? Where there was a set date where then that's it, no more. You know, in a lot of states, certainly it was a few decades later. But people who had slaves in their family, often they stayed on. And that relationship between slave and master kind of changed over time. So we have some evidence of that in our community. So there's an indication that people who were living with the Ellsworth family, and before that the Slocum family, as they died, wound up in that family. There's a girl, Julia Rose, who was an African-American girl who lived with the Ellsworth family, who shows up in the 1850 census. The school records for the District 3 school. When you're heading south down Turk Hill Road, and there's the farm, the first little place on the left past the farm, that's the old District 3 schoolhouse. Julia Rose went to school there with the Ellsworth children, lived with the Ellsworth children, and her parents, I firmly believe, are in that long-lost cemetery. Someday, I hope that we have an opportunity to use ground-penetrating radar and do some discovery there. I've never had the conversation myself, but I believe because that's the only piece of land that really, in anyone's memory, hasn't been farmed, hasn't been plowed, I don't think that's by accident. And I think that's a good thing. Yes?
Is that, excuse me, is that area where you're saying is the cemetery for Black Americans?
And
Is
often the children of
Okay,
the
yeah.
Slocum family or the Ellsworth, because people had a dozen children and, 3 didn't make it.
Okay, I mean, I know when I pass through there, you have the sheep and all the other things on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
Depending on what day, it might be smelly or stinky. But then on the right-hand side, you're right, you just see decrepit stuff. Is there any identification of that? I mean, can anybody go and see it, or is it just only known, only known?
No.
Has there been any effort
The
to?
owner, it might be for tax reasons, claims that he is a equipment dealer.
I've heard about.
And he
things over
buys
there,
it,
strange.
he won't sell anything. Well, I'm told by a friend of his that he won't sell anything. But he calls himself a farm equipment dealer.
Do the Ellsworth still own that?
Yes, they do.
property?
Yes, they do.
So
And
when
he-
did the first Ellsworth, I mean, because it's, you can see it, it's.
I think the Ellsworths got there in the neighborhood of 1830, early
And the family is
1830s.
still the same.
Yeah.
Same family, yeah.
And so behind where you see, that you were talking about, where you see that farm equipment, it's just there. Are there tombstones, or is it just that it's there? So there's nothing for anybody to know it's there.
I am
except for
assuming that there is nothing there to
history? Like,
see.
you could not go there and look at it?
I don't go on anyone's private
Oh, no,
ground
no.
without private land,
Oh, no,
without
no.
permission.
I understand, that means stealthily go in there and check it out, but I'm just saying, is it something that the family has forbidden people to go to?
I have
or-
no indication of that.
They're not social.
And I'm,
You go ask.
I'll go ahead.
No one's ever
Don't
asked,
work.
and no one
Don't-
ever wanted to ask.
but I will tell you
Doesn't work
that
real well.
one of our early maps at that intersection says burial ground. So this isn't all legend.
Now, do these people, because, I mean, I've only lived here, and I've lived here 3 different times since 2006, but only started learning a little bit about Fairport because of the canal. That's the thing that brought me here. And I always heard there were strange ideas about how that property got to be able to be within so close to the village and different kind of things. Do those people, now I might be talking out of turn, but somebody will tell me. Do those people socialize with anybody? You don't know?
I don't know
It's like
the folks.
everybody just stays away.
But as
from
far
the
as
village.
proximity to the village, you have to,
Yeah.
when you're
yeah.
upstairs and you have that great map section, pull out the 1902 map, which is a great illustration of the town of Perinton. And it's a great illustration that really shows the farms and the acreage of the farms.
And the owner.
And the owners. And we were largely an agricultural community, and farms were even in the village. So that's the way it was.
Didn't Chip or the Ellsworth family donate all the property, like where the ambulance corps is and the rec center, town hall? Wasn't that all Ellsworth property?
The Ellsworth family has done a lot of good things for the community.
Yes.
So,
Did they donate the, I thought they sold the property to the town.
I don't know.
I heard they needed-
not that I'm an expert at this, but I do want to talk about a little more varied history. So let me get there if I can. Mention Bushnell's Basin. That's a hamlet within the town of Perinton. Egypt is a hamlet. A hamlet is kind of defined as a little community that doesn't have its own government, but it has its own personality. Egypt, well south of the canal, was also the site of some of our earliest arrivers and had its heyday, in some ways, before the canal became popular. When the canal came through, and do you know what year the canal opened in Perinton for business? 22. Now we're going to celebrate next year, 1825 to 2025, the big statewide celebration for the bicentennial of the canal. But the canal here opened in April of 1822. Once it was ready to go, of course, they started to use it because it was about transportation and commerce. And that really put Bushnell's Basin in a busy, busy way. When the canal opened the first day, there were 10,000 barrels of flour waiting to be shipped. Warehouses sprung up like crazy, and with warehouses, stores, homes, businesses. It became a very booming place for a while. And because there was a time when Bushnell's Basin was the furthest open part of the canal west, because the great embankment between Pittsford and Bushnell's Basin wasn't operational yet, farmers from western and southern places brought their goods to ship on the canal eastbound from some distances away. They had a boomtown situation there for the first year. Egypt, as I mentioned, was very much a booming place in its own right, but it was because it was on the main thoroughfare going to Rochesterville and points eastward by stagecoach. So we had stagecoach inns in Egypt, one of which, ironically, is in Bushnell's Basin. Loud's Tavern was picked up and moved 81, 82, 1981, 82, something like that. It was so close to the road and so decrepit that 99 out of 100 people would have said tear it down. Vivian Tellier Wolfe and her husband, Andrew Wolfe, ran a lot of our local newspapers. They had the passion and the vision and the money to cut up the old inn in several pieces, pick it up, move it down the highway to Bushnell's Basin and set it up. It became one of America's top 10 bed and breakfasts for a while, written up in national magazines. It is not a B&B anymore, it's a private estate. I want to talk to you about transportation for a minute, and I want to use an analogy to give you a sense. Can somebody tell me what time it is, will you?
11:25.
Holy cow. I want to tell you about transportation for a minute. And the reason I want to do that is because I think it's quite a good illustration of how different one community can be to another. We border Penfield to our north. After I left Irondequoit, I went to Penfield, went to Penfield High School. Penfield's nice. This is nicer. Let me tell you that there's a dramatic difference in history that caused those two communities to go in different directions. We were both fundamentally agricultural communities from the beginning. Of course we were. But when the canal came here and opened in 1822, that made us quite different from Penfield. Now we had this cutting-edge thoroughfare that really gave an opportunity for commerce, for business, for manufacturing to spring forth. That's why factories opened their doors in this community, because they could receive their raw materials to make their products and then send their products far and wide. And that happened to some degree, but when it really took off is 1853, when the New York Central Railroad patched together a dozen different little regional railroads to connect railroads to the east and west. And because that route essentially paralleled the canal, why? Because geography dictated it. There's a place that you put canals for a reason, right? You don't put them on top of hills. You put them in this long, linear area where it is the path of least resistance.
Flat.
And the railroad followed that as well. It's flat. Sometimes with the case of the canal, there are waterways that you can tap into to make that part of the canal system, to lend that. Thomas Creek is a little bit of an example of that. So when the railroad got here, boy, did that change things. Railroad got here in 1853. The DeLand factory opened their factory in 1853. The DeLands really put Fairport on the map in terms of creating their products, their baking soda products, many other similar products, that when they did that, something big happened that didn't happen in my beloved Penfield. Streets were built, schools were built, neighborhoods, because workers needed to work in these factories. 20 years after the DeLand factory, 25 years after, the shoe factory on Parse Avenue opened, which became the can factory eventually. When that happened, north side of the village, streets were built, schools were built. Immigrants came to our community to build the canal. First Irish immigrants primarily, some German immigrants. Oh my gosh, by the time the canal had to be widened in the early 1900s, the rush of Italian immigrants to our community. So this place, this village of Fairport, and to some degree the town of Perinton, really experienced this booming atmosphere. Look at a map, drive around our village, and count the number of 19th century streets. There's a lot of them. Go to the four corners of Penfield. There's a couple. The most prominent is Liberty Street that goes like this and like this. Otherwise, there's old pioneer roads that became roads that are the most traveled roads now. First of all, Penfield Road, 441. There's Whalen Road, there's Baird Road, you know, there's those streets that farms were on. We have those streets of our own as we get away from the village to some degree. But nothing in all of Penfield, such as what we have here. And these waves of transportation kept evolving us. I said the canal. And then every time the canal got widened and improved, it magnified that effect. And it happened many times. And then the railroad, 1853. And then the West Shore Railroad got here in the early 1880s. That magnified the effect again. And then the trolley. The Rochester, Syracuse, and Eastern Trolley got here in 1906 and operated to 1931. When it did that, people in Fairport could catch a trolley to East Rochester for 5 cents. They worked in the car shops. They worked in the piano works. They could go to Rochester for 10 cents. I spoke to people when I first started this job. I've been on this historian kick for, this is my 12th year. People who grew up in Egypt and took the trolley to Fairport High School every day. That was transportation. There was no school bus. That gave them the opportunity to go to the high school. Otherwise, they may very well not have even gone. The other difference, finally, between us and how this community evolved, and it involves transportation, and Penfield has a huge valley between it and Rochester. The Irondequoit Valley. Think where Panorama Plaza is. Think where Ellison Park is for the northern parts of Penfield. In the winter, particularly, you couldn't get there. But in Rochester, you could take the train. From Fairport, from Perinton to Rochester. You could take the trolley starting in 1906. You could commute to Rochester every day for work. For Penfield folks, that was an impossibility. That's why our population was growing substantially, particularly in the early 1900s, when Penfield stayed stagnant. Now, one other thing about transportation, and this is fun, 1893, the Chicago World's Fair, also called the Columbian Exposition. Anyone know why?
Because it was the 500th anniversary of the founding of America.
Well, 100 less, 400. Because now, more recently, we were at the 500. Yeah, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, 1492. A few months later, they had the Chicago World's Fair. Celebrated that for months. Here in Fairport, and another reason we're so fortunate, our Fairport newspaper was established in March 1873. Don't ask me why 99 years later, the very same newspaper celebrated their 100th anniversary. They were 100 years off, 1 year off. But in the newspaper for Fairport, they should have read their own paper.
Kurt Gerling was never too fussy about it.
Never let the facts get in the way of a good story. So in 1893, Fairport's newspapers, for months, while the World's Fair in Chicago was held, from about June to October or so, they reported all the names of the people who took the train from Fairport and Perinton to the World's Fair. And they encouraged people. You know, we live in such a world of privacy now. Oh, don't post anything on social media when you're on vacation, or the bad guys will know you're away. Just the opposite. Please let us know if you're going to the World's Fair. We'll publish your name in the newspaper. And people did it. It is amazing that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people went to the train station in Fairport. the passenger train station, got on the train and went straight to Chicago and came back again. And it was a who's who in the village of Fairport. It became like the social notes for that era. Well, so-and-so, did you see? Those 6 women themselves went to Chicago. So much history we share. If you have the opportunity, one of the great things about local history is you can learn things that no one else knows. You can, I find this inspirational. You can become an expert on a topic really easily. Find a topic. Go to nyshistoricnewspapers.org. It is free. It's not difficult to use. There are many search parameters. Some will tell you I'm fibbing. And well, the more you use it, the better you'll get. nyshistoricnewspapers.org. You can pick your newspaper if you want to pick the Fairport newspapers. You can pick Monroe County and then put Fairport in the search window, or Irondequoit. We're fortunate because our newspapers are on there. Are your early newspapers, are they digitized at all? You see, the fact that our newspapers have been digitized is such a benefit to us. I know some communities where they haven't been, and I try to, and they have them bound, and they have them. The fact that they're out there for people to access allows you to do a search. If you wanted to do a search, you could, I'll give you the example I just gave you, 1893. Put that in the search, put Chicago World's Fair. Every time it ever comes up, you'll get every newspaper item. So it's such a beneficial way to learn about our community, and literally you can become an expert about it. So many things to talk about. I think I'm already running out of time. One last thing. Just in case you haven't seen it yet, if you didn't come to my November program here, and you'd like to see and hear the story of Fairport's urban renewal, I am doing it on March 13th at the Perinton Community Center. I'll be right back.
7 o'clock, Bill.
I got the phone number in my wallet, which I stashed back here. Perinton Community Center. All you have to do is reserve seats. It's free. Good God. 223-5050. 223-5050. Yes.
Is it a repeat from the first one?
Well, I think no, it's new and improved. There's new stuff in it. Yeah, it's largely the same. But I've learned some things since, because that's how local history is. You're never done. Yes.
You do have to register for it on the web track.
No, you can just call now. I got it changed.
Okay, sorry.
But thank you. Originally, see, that's one of the things I pushed back and I said, if people have to register on the web track, some people aren't going to do it. I couldn't figure it out. And if you just call, and so now all you have to do is call and say, can I have 2 seats or can I have 10 seats? Plus, we bumped it up to the biggest room imaginable, so we have capacity for anybody and everybody. So come on out, it's a pretty good show. It is emotional for some families. It was the worst thing that ever happened to them. For some families, it was actually a wonderful thing. It was an opportunity. So getting those people in the same room is interesting.
Oh, it's a good program.
Great.
Any other last questions?
What's this thing called?
It's a story of urban renewal in Fairport.
Oh, that's right, urban renewal.
Urban renewal. Just a surprise. I mean, the story of urban renewal started in Fairport in 1962. A good 10 years before anybody would have guessed, but that's how early they started talking about it. Yes?
Quick question, Bill. Is there any reason why Fairport remained calling itself Fairport Village and then Perinton kind of remained town of Perinton? Why not?
Well, first of all, I'm very glad that they did.
Okay.
I think we'd lose some identity if we didn't. However, keep in mind that Perinton started in 1812, spelled many different ways, sometimes with a G on it. But you're raising a good point that I never even got into. Why even are we Fairport in the village? And you know, there are stories that someone stayed at the inn in Fairport, which still exists today. That's the Millstone Block, which is the big building just north of the lift bridge on the west side. It's kind of a minty green.
I live there. I live there.
Now?
I live there. That's one of the reasons I live in Fairport.
Really?
I live there.
So it was...
The green building.
Yes.
It's better inside than the green building.
How about that? Well, the aluminum siding is not original. However, what is the story that almost 200 years ago, there's documentation of someone who stayed there. Imagine, you have folks on their way west. They weren't all coming here. They're working their way west. And they needed to stay somewhere occasionally. And someone looked out and said, what a Fairport is the legend, is the story. And so we've heard that. But back to your question about these identities, we didn't actually become a village incorporated until 1867. But for decades earlier, it was referred to as Fairport. The earliest I've seen the name in print in a publication is a directory for the canal published in the late 1820s. It's amazing what you can find on the Library of Congress website, loc.gov, where there's an actual directory listing all the places on the canal that existed in 1827, I think it was, and how far it is from each one to the next. And Fairport, 2 words, was on there. I am grateful that, unlike some communities, town of Brockport, village of Brockport, town of Pittsford, village of Pittsford, Macedon, and Macedon, in an era where some communities are seeking to get rid of their villages for fiscal reasons or philosophical reasons perhaps, I don't want that to happen. And I think having 2 separate names helps prevent it from happening. It is confusing though, right? Because lots of houses are for sale in Henrietta, and the realtors list them as being a lovely Pittsford home. Dude, you just have a Pittsford post office. Same thing in Perinton if you get down towards Bushnell's Basin. I tease Vicky all the time, who's very much engrossed in the Pittsford history, that Bushnell's Basin is ours, not yours. You know what? A lot of the kids in that end of the community, they go to Pittsford schools. And the zip codes are Pittsford, but it is in the town of Perinton. So we have these identities of these communities, Fairport, Perinton, but I'm glad we still have those both. Any other quick questions before I get out of your hair? Yes.
Back to the farm, the Stinky Farm.
Oh, thank goodness.
You had mentioned that the house on the hill on the northwest corner.
Yeah.
And its history.
Let's talk about those 2 houses. The house on the northwest corner is extraordinarily old. Our town records that I mentioned in the 65,000 documents, one of them from about 1827 references that the town meeting, there was only one meeting a year in those years, the town meeting was held in that building. And it was a tavern at the time. So it is in the neighborhood of 200 years old. The legendary Marjorie Snow Merriman, who we thank for an immense amount of our knowledge and the records and documents behind it, and did so much of that work with the original PHS ladies, and they were all ladies originally. She took photos on a tour of Perinton in the 1940s. And the picture of that place in the 1940s, there were chickens wandering around outside and the windows were boarded up. So for 80 years or more, it has been in a bit of disrepair, and yet it's still standing.
Well, I understand the town.
That's part of the Ellsworth property.
The town had the Ellsworths make it look like a a house
They had to make it look like that.
instead of a shack.
Didn't the town do that?
I'm uneducated as to how that unfolded.
That was the late 1990s.
Now, across the street from there, there's, you know where they sell pumpkins and vegetables and flowers? And there's a little ranch house right there, right next to where their little barn is, where they sell things out of the window.
Yeah.
That little ranch house is 200 years old. There was a fire.
Yes.
You would weep if I could show you photographs of all the houses that are gone due to fires, or for other reasons. But there was a fire there. There was a big Ellsworth house there, the Slocum house probably behind it, and decades ago it burned, and that house is the remaining partial footprint of that house. So little remnants of history.
Where is the schoolhouse? I don't understand where the schoolhouse is.
Where is the schoolhouse? So when you keep going south, like you're going to Eastview Mall, just around the corner, my father, until he passed away, still referred to it as the new mall. As you pass the farm on the left, as you're heading south, the first property past the farm on the left is the District 3 schoolhouse.
And it looks like a schoolhouse.
It still looks like a schoolhouse. It was a one-room schoolhouse, and then a room was added to it, became a two-room schoolhouse. Yes?
There was a commentary I saw on Facebook, and it might have been, no, it was not, I don't know who posted the question of, what's the deal with the stinky farm? So I read through the comments, and there were probably 30, 40 comments, and it was all of them were, you can't call it the stinky farm. All farms are stinky.
Right.
It's the Ellsworth farm. They've done so much for the community. It should be the Ellsworth farm.
I agree.
They were here first.
4 generations.
Literally.
4 generations.
I'm also grateful that there's just not another development there with 200 houses.
Right.
Although I have said personally to town leadership, remember when Penfield a few years ago went through the challenge of Shadow Pines Golf Course was no longer going to be a golf course. Then it was going to be developed, and developers were looking at putting massive amounts of houses. And look what that does to your, I mean, you could perceive that as a good thing, but then, now we need a new school. And our sewer systems are not capable. So there's a lot of infrastructure issues. Someday, that Ellsworth farm, I have suggested to our leadership, is your challenge that is equivalent to that golf course story in Penfield.
Good point.
Because you need to be ready for it. It's going to happen at some point.
Well, I think it was wonderful for the town, and it was Jim Smith, I think, that initiated it, that the horse farm on Turk Hill Road was, I guess, they were given money, and they could stay there for so many years, but it's part of Perinton now.
Yeah, and I thought that,
If we could do something like that, it'd be great.
I thought there was.
So many good things go behind the scenes in our community to make it sustainable, and part of that is conservation easements that have gone a long way towards improving and making our trail system, what it is. Our Crescent Trail system is made up of hundreds of easements for the properties that border it. In some cases, a really mutually beneficial thing. So.
As you go up 250 into Penfield, they took down that old farmhouse and they have a development going in there. Acres and acres, it's so sad. 250.
You're talking about just past the Pines of Perinton.
Going up.
Further.
Right.
Where's that?
It's the Atlantic
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think?
286.
Thank you, folks.